More than 100 million people across the Sahel are living inside a question the world often ignores. Not oil, not gold, not politics, water. Because in the Sahel, water is not just something people drink. Water decides whether a farmer plants or gives up, whether livestock survive or disappear, whether a village stays alive or slowly empties out, whether young people build a future at home or leave because the land can no longer carry them. So when people talk about digging wells across the Sahel, the real question is not just how many wells can be drilled. The real question is this: can water become the foundation of a new African system? The Sahel is not simply a place where water is missing. That is too simple. And when the story is told that way, it hides the real problem. Because in many parts of the Sahel, the issue is not only that rain is scarce, the issue is that water is unreliable, uneven, badly stored, badly mapped, and often disconnected from the people who need it most. One village may have a working borehole. Another village may walk for hours. One farming area may receive rain too late. Another may receive too much at once, then watch the water disappear before it can be stored. One community may sit above groundwater, but lack the equipment, the data, the maintenance system, or the energy needed to use it safely. That is why the idea of digging wells across the Sahel is so powerful. A well is not just a hole in the ground. A well is a promise. It says a family can stay. A farmer can plant. A herder can move with less fear. A village can survive the dry season without waiting for emergency aid. But this is also where the danger begins, because a well can become a symbol faster than it becomes a system. A camera can show the first water rising from the ground. People can cheer. A government can announce progress. A video can go viral. But 6 months later, the real test begins. Is the pump still working? Is the water still safe? Who repairs it when it breaks? Who pays for the parts? Who decides which village receives the next well? Who makes sure the groundwater is not being drained faster than it can recover? These are not small questions. These are the questions that separate development from performance. Because if the Sahel wants to turn water into sovereignty, it cannot treat wells as isolated miracles. It must treat them as one connected system: water, agriculture, maintenance, mapping, and public trust. This is why the conversation around millions of wells must be handled carefully. The number sounds dramatic, but the real transformation would not come from the number alone. It would come from coordination. Where are the aquifers? Which areas can support irrigation without exhausting the water table? Which communities need drinking water first? Which routes need water access for livestock? Which wells need local repair teams before the first machine even starts drilling? That is the hidden architecture behind the dream. And without that architecture, millions of wells could become millions of broken promises. Some would dry out. Some would be contaminated. Some would be captured by local power networks. Some would be built where the camera looks good, not where the need is greatest. That is the mistake the Sahel cannot afford, because water is too important to become another political performance. For Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and the wider Sahel, water is the beginning of everything. Before agriculture, food security, livestock, wealth, rural jobs, and families believing in a future at home, there is water. So when we talk about wells in the Sahel, we are not just talking about infrastructure. We are talking about whether the region can build the foundation of life before the next crisis arrives. Because the desert does not wait for speeches. The dry season does not wait for political slogans. And a farmer standing over cracked soil does not need another promise. He needs a system that reaches him before hope runs out. Now the story moves beneath the sand. Because the Sahel is often shown from above. Dry land, dusty roads, cracked soil, villages sitting under a sun that looks merciless. From that view, the region can look empty, but that image is incomplete. Because under parts of the Sahel, there is another world, a hidden water world. Not a miracle, not an endless ocean waiting to be exploited, but groundwater, aquifers, shallow reserves near rivers and lowlands. Underground systems that could help farmers, herders, and villages survive if they are mapped, managed, protected, and used with discipline. This is why water in the Sahel is not only a humanitarian issue, it is a strategic issue. If a country controls water, it controls the beginning of food. If it controls food, it controls part of its political stability. If it controls rural production, it gives young people one more reason to stay. And if it can connect water to energy storage roads and markets, then a dry region can begin to change its economic future. But this is where the story becomes complicated. Because groundwater is not like gold. You cannot simply extract it and celebrate. Water is alive inside a system. If you take too much, the system weakens. If you drill without data, the well may fail. If you pump without maintenance, the machine becomes useless. If you irrigate without drainage, soil can degrade. If you give access only to powerful people, the poor remain thirsty beside the same promise made in their name. That is why the hidden treasure beneath the Sahel must be treated carefully. It can become a foundation for resilience, or it can become another resource captured by the few. The first step is knowledge. Before a drilling machine arrives, the state must know what is under the ground. Where is the aquifer? How deep is the water? How fast does it recharge? Is the water safe for drinking? Is it better used for households, livestock, or irrigation? Could a solar pump work there? Could a village repair the system locally? These questions are not as emotional as a speech, but they decide whether the well becomes life or becomes a broken concrete circle in the desert. And this is why mapping matters. A map of groundwater is not just a technical document. It is a sovereignty document. It tells a country where it can grow food, where it can support pastoral routes, where it can protect villages, where it must be careful, where drilling would waste money, and where water could become the first link in a new rural economy. Imagine a Sahel village where the water system actually works. The well is not isolated. It is connected to a local repair team. The pump runs on solar power. The water is tested. A small irrigation zone is planned around it. Nearby farmers grow vegetables during the dry season. A storage unit keeps produce from rotting. A road connects the village to a market. A small processing unit turns raw harvest into something with higher value. That is when a well stops being a well. It becomes an economic node, a place where water becomes food. Food becomes income. Income becomes stability. And stability becomes the beginning of sovereignty. This is the part most people miss. When they hear dig wells, they imagine charity. But in the Sahel, the larger question is system design. Who owns the water point? Who maintains it? Who pays when the pump breaks? Who prevents overuse? Who protects women and children from walking unsafe distances? Who ensures herders and farmers do not fight over access? Who stops local elites from turning public water into private control? This is why millions of wells, if they ever became a serious regional goal, would have to be more than a drilling campaign. They would have to become a governance campaign, a data campaign, a maintenance campaign, a food security campaign, and a trust campaign. Because water can heal a region. But water can also expose every weakness inside the state. Weak planning, weak maintenance, weak accountability, weak land rights, weak conflict resolution, and weak protection for the people who need access most. So the hidden water beneath the Sahel is not only a gift, it is a responsibility. And if Traoré AES or any Sahel government wants to turn water into sovereignty, the first victory will not be the number of wells announced. The first victory will be proving that each water point belongs to a system strong enough to keep it alive. But this is where the dream becomes dangerous, because from a distance, digging wells sounds simple. Bring the machine, drill into the earth, find water, install the pump, show the village celebrating, then move to the next location. That image is powerful. It is emotional. It is easy to understand. And it is exactly why water projects can become politically attractive. A well gives people something visible. A camera can film it. A speech can turn it into proof, but the reality under the ground is far less simple, because the Sahel is not one flat desert with the same water waiting everywhere. The land changes, the rock changes, the depth changes, the water quality changes, the recharge rate changes. And if a government treats every village the same, the results can become uneven very quickly. One well works, another fails. One pump lasts, another breaks. One water point serves the public. Another becomes controlled by a local power network. One borehole supports life. Another becomes a dry monument to a promise that was never maintained. That is why the first risk is technical. You cannot drill a sustainable water future with guesswork. You need mapping, hydrogeology, water testing, local data maintenance, planning, and a clear understanding of whether the water can recover after people begin using it. Because groundwater is not infinite. If a pump is too powerful, it can drain faster than the aquifer recharges. If irrigation expands without discipline, the same water that saves one season can weaken the next. If the water contains minerals, salt, or contamination, the village may receive access but still face health risks. If the soil cannot handle poor drainage, irrigation can slowly damage the land it was supposed to save. That is why drilling is only the beginning. The second risk is maintenance. This is the part that rarely appears in viral videos. A broken pump does not look as dramatic as a new well. A missing spare part does not make a strong political image. But maintenance decides everything. A well that works for 1 month is not development. A well that works for 10 years begins to change life. So before a serious water program drills at scale, it must answer boring questions. Who owns the pump? Who trains the repair team? Where are spare parts stored? Who pays for replacement parts? How quickly can a broken system be fixed? Can villagers report failure without needing political connections? If those questions are ignored, the project may look huge on paper and weak on the ground. The third risk is energy. Water underground is not useful if people cannot afford to lift it. Diesel pumps can be expensive. Fuel supply can be unstable. Manual systems may not support irrigation at the level needed for food production. Solar pumps can change the equation, especially in a region with intense sunlight. But solar irrigation also creates a new danger. When pumping becomes cheaper, people may pump more. If there is no water, accounting no limits, and no local management, success can turn into overuse. That is the contradiction. The same technology that unlocks water can also exhaust it. So solar is not a magic solution. It is a tool. And like every tool, it needs rules. The fourth risk is conflict. In the Sahel, water is not only about households. It is about farmers, herders, livestock, routes, fields, gardens, markets, and survival. If a new well is placed in the wrong location, it can change local power. It can pull herders into farming zones. It can increase pressure around one village. It can create disputes over who has priority in the dry season. It can make one group feel favored and another group feel abandoned. That is why water planning must include local conflict resolution before the conflict begins. A well can reduce tension, but a badly governed well can also concentrate tension. The fifth risk is capture. This may be the most political risk of all. Who decides where the wells go? Who receives the contracts? Who supplies the pumps? Who controls the data? Who collects local fees? Who gets water first when demand is greater than supply? If the answer is hidden, then the water project becomes vulnerable, not because water is bad, but because water is power. And every form of power attracts gatekeepers. That is why the Sahel cannot treat water as charity. It must treat water as public infrastructure, measured, mapped, maintained, audited, protected, and connected to food, energy, roads, storage, and markets. Because the goal is not to dig 1,000,000 holes. The goal is to build 1,000,000 functioning lifelines. There is a huge difference. A hole can be counted. A lifeline must be kept alive. And if the Sahel understands that difference, then water can become the beginning of a new system. But if it ignores that difference, the desert will not be defeated. It will simply be decorated with broken promises. This is where the water story meets the AES story. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, water is not just rural development. It is sovereignty. A country that cannot secure water cannot secure food. A country that cannot secure food cannot fully control its future. In a region that depends on outside emergency response every time the dry season becomes harder, will always remain vulnerable to pressure. That is why wells, boreholes, irrigation, storage, and groundwater mapping matter far beyond the village. They are part of the state. They are part of the economy. They are part of whether the Sahel can stop being described only as a crisis zone and start being organized as a production zone. For Traoré and the AES, this is the deeper opportunity not just to speak about independence, but to make independence visible in water. Because sovereignty becomes real when a farmer does not wait for imported food, when a village survives the dry season, when a young person sees work in the land, and when water turns into food, income, and stability. But this is also where the test becomes brutal, because water will expose whether the new Sahel project is serious about systems. If AES talks about unity, then water planning must cross borders. Pastoral routes do not stop at a political line. Drought pressure does not respect a customs post. Food markets do not survive if one country plans alone while the next one breaks under shortage. So a true Sahel water strategy cannot be only national. It has to be regional. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger would need to think together about groundwater data, livestock routes, irrigation zones, grain storage, solar pumping, rural roads, and emergency reserves. That is how water becomes a regional shield, not by drilling randomly, but by connecting each water point to the larger survival map. And this is where AES can separate itself from old politics. The old model often treated the Sahel as a place to manage after crisis, food aid after shortage, emergency meetings after drought, security responses after collapse. But a sovereignty model asks a different question: what must be built before the crisis arrives? That question changes everything. It moves the story from reaction to prevention, from aid to production, from speeches to planning, from survival to strategy. But there is a danger here. If water becomes only a political image, the project will fail. If every well is used as propaganda, but no one tracks whether it still works, people will lose trust. If the best water access goes first to politically connected areas, the promise of sovereignty will start to feel selective. If data is hidden, contracts are opaque, and maintenance is weak, then water will not defeat dependency. It will reproduce it. Only this time the dependency will be local. That is the line Traoré and AES cannot afford to cross. Because the Sahel does not only need more water points, it needs fair water governance, public maps, trained technicians, transparent contracts, local committees that are not captured, and rural communities included before decisions are locked. And most importantly, it needs proof. Proof that the wells still work after the cameras leave. Proof that water reaches the communities that need it most. Proof that irrigation increases food production without destroying the water table. Proof that the project serves people before it serves political image. That is why water could become the cleanest test of AES sovereignty. Because people do not drink ideology. They drink water. They do not feed children with speeches. They feed them with harvests. And if AES can turn water into food jobs and stability, then sovereignty will no longer be only a political word. It will become something ordinary people can touch every morning. But once the Sahel begins talking about water at scale, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who receives the water first? This question sounds simple, but in a dry region, it can decide the entire future of a village. Because water is not only a resource, water is priority power in survival. And when the supply is limited, every decision reveals what kind of system is being built. Does the first well go to the village with the deepest need, or to the region with the strongest political connection? Does irrigation reach small farmers first, or large projects that look impressive from the air? Do herders receive protected water routes, or are they left to compete with farmers until conflict grows? Do women and children get safer access near the village, or are they still walking long distances while leaders celebrate a project somewhere else? This is where water becomes political in the deeper sense of who is seen, who is counted, and who is asked to wait. Every water strategy has a hidden moral map. It shows which lives are treated as urgent and which lives are treated as patient. That is why millions of wells is not only a technical dream, it is a distribution question. If the Sahel drills at scale, the real test will not be the total number announced. The real test will be the pattern. Where are the wells located? Who chose the locations? Was the decision based on data need and long-term sustainability? Or was it based on visibility, loyalty, and political reward? Because the wrong pattern can create new inequalities. One district may become greener, another may remain dry. One group may gain access to irrigation. Another may lose grazing space. One village may receive water storage and a road. Another may receive only a speech. And when people begin to see that pattern, trust becomes fragile. This is why allocation must be public, not hidden inside ministries, decided only by contractors controlled by local elites, or announced only after everything is already finished. A serious water strategy must tell people why one place comes first, why another place comes later, and how the next phase will reach those still waiting. That kind of transparency does not weaken a government. It strengthens trust, because people can accept waiting if they believe the process is fair. But people do not accept waiting when they believe someone else is benefiting from their silence. This is especially important in rural areas, because rural communities are often asked to carry the burden of national survival. They grow the food, protect livestock, keep land productive, and absorb climate pressure before cities feel it. And yet, too often, they receive the last investment. That cannot happen if water is supposed to become the foundation of sovereignty. If the Sahel wants real transformation, rural water access must not be treated as charity. It must be treated as strategic infrastructure. A village well is not small. It can decide whether people stay on the land. A livestock water point can reduce pressure along migration routes. A small irrigation system can turn one harvest into two. A repaired pump can save a community from walking back into desperation. This is where Traoré and the AES face a difficult truth. A revolution can speak for the people, but it must also design for the people, not for cameras, capital cities, or symbolic projects that look powerful in a speech. For the people who wake up before sunrise and ask the most basic question on earth: where will the water come from today? If AES can answer that question fairly, village by village, route by route, farm by farm, then water becomes more than infrastructure. It becomes public trust. But if water access becomes selective, hidden, or captured, then the project will create the very resentment it claims to solve. Because in the Sahel, water does not simply expose the ground. It exposes the system. It shows whether sovereignty is being built for everyone, or whether the new future already has a gate. But if the Sahel gets this right, the result could be much bigger than Wells. Because water is not the final goal. Water is the first domino. When water becomes reliable, agriculture changes. When agriculture changes, food security changes. And when food security changes, villages begin to look different. This is why a serious water strategy could become one of the most important development weapons in the Sahel. Not a weapon of violence, a weapon of survival, production, and resistance against hunger, migration pressure, rural collapse, and the feeling that the land itself has stopped offering a future. Imagine what happens when a farmer no longer depends only on one short rainy season. He can plant more carefully. He can grow vegetables in the dry season. He can protect part of the harvest. He can sell when prices are better. He can hire help. He can keep his children in school. That is not just agriculture. That is stability. Now multiply that across villages. A working well becomes a garden. A garden becomes income. Income supports local trade. Trade supports markets. And small processing begins to keep value inside the region instead of sending everything away raw. This is the real power of water. It does not only produce crops, it produces time. It gives families time before the next emergency, farmers time to plan, young people time to imagine a future at home, and communities time to build instead of only survive. And this is where the Great Green Wall becomes important, because the dream of greening the Sahel was never supposed to be only about planting trees. Trees die if the system around them is weak. Restoration fails if communities do not benefit. Land cannot recover if people are too desperate to protect it. But when water farming, grazing, soil restoration, and local jobs are connected, the idea becomes stronger. A green belt is not built by planting and walking away. It is built by communities that have a reason to protect the land. That means water points, soil management, drought-resistant crops, livestock routes, small irrigation, storage, and real income from restoration. Not just another climate slogan. If the Sahel can connect wells to that larger system, water becomes the engine behind land recovery. But if the wells stand alone, the impact stays small. This is the difference between a project and a transformation. A project can be announced. A transformation must connect. Water must connect to food. Food must connect to roads. Roads must connect to markets. Markets must connect to jobs. And jobs must connect back to trust. That is how sovereignty becomes visible. Not through one dramatic announcement, but through thousands of ordinary improvements that begin to reinforce each other. A village grows food. A road moves it. A market sells it. A small factory processes it. A family earns from it. A young person stays. That is the chain. And if that chain becomes real, the Sahel's water strategy could do something powerful. It could reduce the pressure that pushes people away from the land. Not because migration is wrong. People have always moved. But forced movement is different. When people leave because the land cannot feed them, because livestock cannot survive, because the village has no water, because the future feels dead, that is not opportunity. That is pressure. Water cannot solve every problem. It cannot end insecurity by itself. It cannot erase poverty overnight. It cannot replace schools, hospitals, roads, energy, or good governance. But water can make every other solution more possible. Without water, agriculture stays fragile. Without agriculture, rural jobs stay weak. Without rural jobs, young people lose patience. Without patience, the state loses trust. That is why the Sahel water question is not small. It is the question underneath everything. If water is managed badly, it becomes another broken promise. But if water is managed well, it becomes the first proof that the Sahel can build life where the world only expected desert. So the real question is not whether the Sahel can dig wells. The real question is whether the Sahel can build a water system strong enough to change life. Because a well by itself is only a beginning. A pump by itself is only a tool. A borehole by itself is only an opening in the ground. The transformation begins when water becomes reliable. When reliable water becomes food. When food becomes income. When income becomes stability. And when stability gives people a reason to believe the future does not have to be somewhere else. That is the chain. Water, food, sovereignty. And if Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and the wider Sahel can protect that chain, then independence stops being only a flag, a speech, or a political position against the old order. It becomes something ordinary people can touch. A mother filling a container closer to home. A farmer planting after the dry season begins. A herder finding water before conflict starts. A young person earning from the land instead of abandoning it. A village staying alive because the state reached it before the crisis did. That is what water can do. But only if the system is honest. Only if the wells are mapped. Only if the pumps are maintained. Only if the groundwater is protected. Only if the contracts are transparent. Only if rural communities are not used as background images for political announcements. Only if the people who need water most are not the last ones to receive it. Because the desert is not fooled by slogans. The dry season does not care about speeches. And a broken pump does not become useful because someone once cut a ribbon beside it. This is the hard truth. The Sahel does not need millions of holes in the ground. It needs millions of functioning lifelines. It needs water points that still work after the cameras leave. It needs irrigation that grows food without destroying the future. It needs local repair teams, public maps, fair access, and leaders willing to measure success, not by announcements, but by survival. If that happens, then wells could become more than infrastructure. They could become the first visible proof that the Sahel is not condemned to remain a crisis zone. They could become proof that African sovereignty is not only about resisting pressure from outside, it is also about building systems strong enough to serve people inside. And maybe that is the real water revolution. Not turning the Sahel into a fantasy overnight, but proving village by village, well by well, harvest by harvest, that life can return to land the world had already written off. Disclaimer, this video is fictional storytelling created for education, commentary, and entertainment. It is not a factual report or official information. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. Please enjoy it as creative content only.